The auction inventory sheet listed it as item 47, no photograph. No description beyond 4 words printed in faded ink at the bottom of the page, diesel pump, as is. That was the entire listing. Frank Dawson, who had been running county farm auctions in Harlan County, Kansas for 19 years, barely glanced at it when he read it aloud. He moved on quickly. There were tractors to sell, a flatbed trailer with good tires, a grain auger that still worked, real equipment people might actually want. Nobody walked over to look at item 47. The pump sat behind the barn where Clarence Albright's failed farm had been picked apart piece by piece over the course of one dry October morning in 1982. It was enormous, even by the standards of the era, a hulking, cast-iron diesel irrigation pump manufactured sometime in the late 1940s, its body buried under rust the color of old blood. There were oil stains running the length of the engine block that looked decades deep. The fuel lines had cracked and gone dry. A sparrow had built a nest in the exhaust stack and nobody had removed it. Mike Turner, who farmed 500 acres of wheat and corn just east of the Cimarron Fork, walked past it and laughed out loud. Not meanly, just the way a man laughs when he sees something obviously beyond saving. "Somebody ought to pay Frank to haul that off," he said to nobody in particular. 3 men standing nearby agreed. Then Sarah Whitmore walked over, crouched down beside it in her canvas work jacket, and spent 12 minutes examining it without saying a single word. Nobody in Harlan County would have called Sarah Whitmore remarkable. That was exactly the problem with their understanding of her. She had taken over the Whitmore farm after her husband Ray died of a heart attack in the spring of 1979. 41 years old, 1 teenage son, 320 acres of mixed grain and alfalfa, and a reputation in the county as a quiet woman who mostly kept to herself. The neighbors figured she would sell. The bank expected she would sell. Even her son Daniel, who was 17 and restless and had no particular love for farming, assumed that eventually they would sell. None of them understood what she had grown up inside. Her father, Everett Hollis, had spent 40 years repairing diesel engines and irrigation equipment across 4 counties in southwest Kansas. He had never gone to college. He had never needed to. He kept his knowledge in a set of composition notebooks, 11 of them by the time he died in 1974, filled with measurements diagrams. Notes written in a cramped mechanical hand that recorded everything he had ever learned about how pumps worked, why they failed, what could be saved, and what could not. Sarah had read every one of those notebooks twice by the time she was 16. She thought about them while she crouched next to item 47 and pressed 2 fingers against the pump housing and felt the thickness of the cast iron beneath the rust. She looked at the intake mouth. She measured the diameter with her handspan. Then she stood up, walked over to Frank Dawson's table, and put her name on the bid sheet for $38. When Frank called item 47, there were exactly 2 bids. A junkyard operator from Liberal named Casper offered $20 for the scrap iron value. Sarah offered $38. Casper shook his head. Frank called it sold. Mike Turner was talking to 2 other farmers 30 feet away when he heard it. He turned around and looked at Sarah. "You buying that thing, Sarah?" "Already did," she said. He looked at the pump. He looked at her. He smiled the way men smile when they have decided to be polite about something they find genuinely puzzling. "Well," he said, "good luck with it." She thanked him and went to find her truck. Daniel helped her load it with a rented hydraulic dolly. He was strong and quiet and had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he spent most of the loading process thinking of a reason to ask what she intended to do with it. He finally asked halfway home. "That pump," he said. "What's the plan?" "Fix it," she said. He waited for more. More didn't come. He looked out the window at the flat brown November fields and said nothing else. She started on it the first week of December, in the machine shed behind the house where Ray had kept his tools in the kind of order that bordered on obsessive. She lit the propane heater, pulled her father's notebooks from the shelf where she kept them next to the parts manuals, and set a cup of coffee on the workbench beside them. The pump was a Johnston Brothers Model 14, manufactured in Wichita in 1940. She knew this because she had found the manufacturer's plate on the underside of the housing, mostly hidden under a 1/4 inch of caked sediment that she chipped away with a putty knife on the second day. She cross-referenced the serial number against the Johnston Brothers catalog she had sent away from a pump supply house in Dodge City. and the catalog arrived 10 days later with diagrams that matched what she was looking at almost perfectly. The impeller was intact. That was the first thing she needed to know, and the fact that it was gave her a quiet satisfaction that didn't show on her face. Daniel came into the shed on a Saturday in mid-December, hands in his pockets, breath-making clouds in the cold air. He watched her for a while without speaking. "That impeller the main thing?" he finally asked. She was surprised. Not that he'd asked, that he'd known what to look for. "One of the main things," she said. "Impeller's the heart of it. That's what throws the water. If that's cracked or warped, you got a very expensive piece of iron." "Is it okay?" "It's okay." It set it down carefully on a clean shop rag. "Cast iron like this doesn't corrode the same way the housing does. It's been dry in here. Dry is better than wet for iron." He nodded slowly, looking at the impeller the way you look at something when you're recalibrating what it was worth. "Why'd everybody else walk past it?" he asked. She picked up her coffee. "Because it looked bad," she said. And looking bad is usually enough. January was dry. February was dry. The Kansas weather reports were routine about it. Sarah worked on the pump through both months. She rebuilt the fuel system, replaced cracked lines, flushed the tank, packed the shaft bearings with fresh grease from a speck in her father's notebook. She machined a new gasket for the priming port from sheet material ordered out of Garden City because the original had deteriorated into something that resembled dark cardboard. Then, on a Thursday morning in late February, she found the crack. It was in the volute housing, the curved passage that channels water from the spinning impeller toward the discharge outlet. She found it only because she was running a clean rag along the inside surface and felt the ridge under her fingers before she saw it with her eyes, a hairline fracture, maybe 4 inches long, running diagonally across the lower half of the casting. Old, settled deep into the iron. The kind of crack that doesn't happen overnight. She stood there for a long moment with the rag in her hand. A volute crack that size, under operating pressure, would weep first and then open. It might hold for a season, or it might blow apart the first time the pump worked hard against a dry lift. She didn't know which. There was no way to know which without pressurizing it, and pressurizing a cracked housing without a repair was how you turned a fixable problem into a pile of iron fragments on your shed floor. She set the rag down. She went inside and ate lunch and did not say anything to Daniel about it. That evening she pulled notebook number 4 off the shelf and went looking for what her father had written about cast iron fractures. She found it in the third-to-last entry, 2 pages, written in 1968 after he had repaired a cracked pump casing on a farm near Meade. He had preheated the housing with a propane torch, grooved the crack with a carbide bit, and welded it shut with nickel iron rod. Then let it cool, covered in dry sand, for 6 hours to prevent the iron from hardening too fast and recracking from thermal shock. She read it twice, then she sat with it. The problem was the weld. She could not weld cast iron herself. Not the way her father had described it, not with the precision that housing required. One mistake in temperature management, and the heat stress would propagate new cracks in the surrounding metal. She would need a welder who had done this specific repair before. In Harlan County in the winter of 1983, that was not a short list, it was a list of one. His name was Denny Fair. He had worked at the county co-op for 22 years, was retired now, and kept a rod welder in his garage mostly out of habit. Sarah drove to his place on a Saturday morning and explained what she had. Denny came to the shed, looked at the crack, turned the housing in his hands, and said nothing for nearly 2 minutes. "It's not through the wall yet," he said finally. "I know. If it was through the wall, I'd say scrap it. I know that too." He looked at her. "It'll take me 2 visits. I'll preheat it next Saturday, do the weld, let it cool under sand. Come back the following week to grind and dress it. Then you pressure test it before you do anything else with it. What do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "You let me know if it holds." She thanked him, and he left, and she stood in the shed alone for a while. The pump sat on the floor looking the same as it always had. Enormous patient, heavily rusted everywhere except the part she had cleaned, and for the first time since the auction she genuinely did not know if it was going to work. Denny came back the following Saturday as promised. He preheated the housing with the deliberate care of someone who has made this mistake before and does not want to make it again. The weld took 40 minutes. The cooling took 6 hours under a bed of dry sand that Sarah had ordered specifically for the purpose. She sat in the shed for most of that time doing other work, not watching the housing, because watching it would not help anything. The next Saturday, Denny ground and dressed the weld flush. The repair was clean, a thin, gray seam running diagonally across the volute, barely visible unless you looked for it. They pressure tested the housing with a hand pump and a gauge, capping the discharge port in the intake, pressurizing the water-filled cavity to 30 pounds per square inch, about what the pump would see under normal operating load. They watched it for 10 minutes. No weep, no drop on the gauge. "Holds," Denny said. Sarah wrote the date and the test pressure in her log. She did not say much else. But that night she told Daniel about the crack. She told him all of it, finding it, the notebooks, Denny, the weld, the test. He listened without interrupting. "You thought it was done," he said. "Not a question." "For about a day," she said. "Then I went to the notebook." He was quiet for a moment. What if the notebook hadn't had anything about it? She considered that honestly. "Then I would have called around until I found someone who knew," she said. "Your grandfather didn't write down everything. He wrote down what he had learned. The rest of it you still have to go find." March brought a new problem. The diesel engine would start. She had gotten it to fire twice, but it wouldn't hold speed. It surged and dropped, a rhythmic stuttering she recognized from notebook number 3 as a governor problem. The governor on a diesel engine controls fuel delivery to maintain steady RPM. If it hunts, the engine cannot hold the pump shaft at the speed needed to generate discharge pressure. She pulled the governor assembly off the engine block and carried it to the kitchen table where the light was better, and spent 3 evenings disassembling it with watchmaker's patience. The problem was a worn pivot pin in the flyweight mechanism, a part so small it fit inside her thumbnail, that had developed just enough slop to throw the governor's response off calibration. She couldn't buy a replacement. Johnston Brothers had not made parts for the Model 14 since 1960. She drove to Wichita on a Tuesday in late March and spent 4 hours at a machine shop explaining what she needed. And a machinist named Gerald, who had been doing custom work for 40 years, made her 3 identical pivot pins from a steel specification she brought, written on a card. She installed the best of the 3 on a Thursday night while Daniel watched from his overturned bucket. On Friday morning, she primed the pump with a hand pour of water, cracked the fuel rack, and started the engine. It idled rough for about 20 seconds. Then the governor found its range. The engine settled into a low, even throb that filled the machine, shed the way a well-tuned instrument fills a room. Not loud, steady, purposeful. Daniel looked at his mother. She was already writing something in the Johnston Brothers catalog's margin. She didn't look up. She believed it, but she had said the same thing to herself about the volute housing in December, and that had nearly ended differently. She kept that thought to herself, wrote down the RPM reading, and started planning the installation. Nobody in Harlan County was thinking about pumps in April of 1983. They were thinking about planting, and about the dry winter, and about stay payment programs, and about their own problems. The county had real concerns. The farm economy had been grinding hard for several years. Interest rates were brutal. Equipment loans were crushing operations that looked fine on paper. Mike Turner had 3 electric irrigation pumps on his stretch of the fork. He had bought 2 of them new in 1978 and 1 in 1981. He owed money on all 3. He was not a reckless man. He was actually quite careful, but he had made his irrigation plans the same way every farmer along the fork had made them, based on the assumption that the river would behave the way it always had. He saw Sarah Whitmore at the feed store in Harlan in early May, and because he was a decent man and not genuinely unkind, he asked how that old pump of hers was coming along. "It runs," she said. He waited for more. More didn't come. "You got a place to put it?" he asked. "Working on it." She had been. She had spent April digging and preparing a pump installation point on the low-cut bank of the fork where it crossed the south corner of Whitmore land. But before she finalized the installation depth, she had gone back to the notebooks, not to confirm what she already planned, to see if she had missed anything. She found it in notebook number 9, near the back, in a section she had not thought much about when she first read it as a teenager. Her father had written it in 1971 after consulting with a county water surveyor on a job near the Oklahoma line. The surveyor had shown him something in the historical river records, a pattern that Everett had found striking enough to write 4 careful paragraphs about. In extreme drought years, he had written, the Cimarron Fork didn't just drop in depth, it dropped in channel position. The main flow thread migrated toward the deepest cut in the bed, sometimes shifting laterally by several feet. A fixed intake pipe aimed at the center of a normal waterline could end up pointed at dry gravel if the channel moved during a serious low-water event. The solution, her father wrote, was to extend the intake pipe with a flexible joint at the end, a short section of heavy rubber hose clamped to the rigid pipe, so the intake mouth could be adjusted toward wherever the water actually was without pulling the entire installation apart. Sarah read that section 3 times. She had planned the intake depth based on the river dropping. She had not planned for the river moving. She ordered the flexible hose section from the plumbing supplier in Dodge City and redesigned the intake terminus before she poured the concrete pad. The change cost her 4 days and $22 in additional materials. She did not know yet if it would matter. She noted it in her log with her father's notebook reference beside it, N-bind P44, and went back to work. June arrived warm and wrong. The rain that usually came with the spring wheat season was absent in a way that was notable even by Kansas standards. The county extension office sent out a single-page advisory in mid-June, noting that soil moisture levels were below the 40-year average. Standard language. The kind of notice people fold in half and leave on the kitchen counter. What was not standard was what the Cimarron Fork was doing. Sarah had been reading the river all spring. Not formally, she had no official instruments, but she had driven the county road along the fork every week since April and noted what she saw in a spiral notepad. By late June, the river had dropped 14 inches from its April level. She ran the diesel pump for 45 minutes as a test, verified that it was pulling water smoothly at current depth, and noted the numbers. Not triumphant, just noting. Daniel came down to the river while she was running it. He stood beside her and watched the discharge water flowing strong out of the mainline junction, listened to the steady low thunder of the diesel. "That's a lot of water," he said. "It's doing its job," she said. "How much lower can the river go before it starts having trouble?" She looked at him. He had asked the right question, the exact right question. "A lot lower than the other pumps can handle," she said. He looked at the river, then at the pump. Then he wrote something in his notebook. What nobody mentioned that June, because it was the kind of thing that feels too early to say out loud, was that the pump had not yet been tested under the conditions that would actually matter. Running clean at 14 inches below normal was not the same as running clean at 2 feet below normal, or 3. The weld on the volute housing had held at 30 psi in a cold test in a machine shed. It had not held under sustained operating load through a Kansas summer. These were different things. Sarah knew they were different things. She did not say so to anyone because there was nothing useful to say about it. You ran the machine and you watched it and you kept records. By late June, Mike Turner had his own problems to deal with, and they were sharpening fast. His 3 electric pumps were all pulling, but the easternmost one, the newest, the one he'd bought in 1981 and still owed $14,000 on, was showing pressure fluctuation on the discharge gauge, not catastrophic, just inconsistent. A modern centrifugal pump running near its suction limit will begin to cavitate as the available water surface drops toward the intake. The impeller starts pulling air along with water, the pressure spikes and falls. The pump sounds wrong in a way you feel more than hear, a low rattling, almost like something loose inside a machine that used to be tight. He reset the intake depth on July 3rd, lowering it 6 inches by repositioning the foot pipe. Problem solved, he thought. He went home. By July 12th, the river had dropped another 8 inches and the pressure fluctuation was back. He drove to the pump before breakfast in the gray early light and stood there watching the gauge needle hunt back and forth and listening to that low rattle and not saying anything. Then he drove back to the house and called a pump supplier in Dodge City, who told him the intake needed to go lower or he needed a different pump style. The supplier suggested a submersible. Turner asked the price. He thanked the man and hung up without ordering anything. He spent 3 days engineering a workaround, a weighted pipe extension he fabricated himself from fittings at the co-op, designed to push the intake another foot deeper. He had it installed by July 16th, working in water that barely covered his boots, sweating in the kind of July heat that feels personal. The extended intake worked for 6 days. On July 2020, the river dropped again. Turner's east pump lost prime entirely, the intake now so close to the bottom of the diminished channel that it was pulling sand as much as water. The motor ran hot, and he shut it down before it burned. He spent the rest of that day trying to save it, repositioning, repriming, testing again. He got it running by evening. He drove home and ate dinner and did not talk about it. The following Tuesday, he pulled into his field at first light and found all 3 gauges reading 0. The river had dropped 4 more inches overnight. All 3 intakes were effectively above the remaining water thread which had migrated, just as rivers will do when they are running out, toward the deepest seam in the bed, 22 inches from where it had been in April. He stood there in the field for a long time. The motors were still running, spinning impellers in air, moving nothing. He walked from pump to pump and shut each one down manually. Then he got back in his truck and drove to the Whitmore place. Sarah was at the river when he arrived. She was checking the intake connection on the flexible hose section, making a small adjustment with a pipe wrench. Turner parked and walked down to the bank and saw the diesel pump running on its pad, water flowing strong and steady through the discharge main line. He stood there for a moment. Her intake, he could see, was sitting 1.5 feet lower than where his installations had been positioned. And the mouth of it, he hadn't noticed before, was aimed not at the center of the channel, but slightly toward the east bank, following the current thread of the remaining flow. He had no idea how she had known to do that. He took his hat off. "My east pump's been fighting since July," he said. "Lost all 3 this morning." She set the wrench down on the pad and looked at him. "I've got 60 acres of corn that might survive if I can get water to the main line by the end of the week," he said. "I'll pay you whatever you think is fair. You can run a pipe from your east main line to my junction at the fence line," she said. "Tap in there. It'll handle it." He looked at her. "What do I owe you?" "Help me dig the connection trench," she said. "Bring your backhoe." He had his backhoe there before noon. He did not ask how she had aimed the intake toward the channel thread. He was not sure he could have absorbed the answer at that particular moment. He dug the trench, and they laid the connection pipe, and by late afternoon his corn was taking water. He sat on the tailgate of his truck before he left, looking at the river, or what was left of it, and then at the diesel pump on its low concrete pad running. Something in his expression had changed from the morning. The confidence that was such a fixed feature of his face had not disappeared. It had just made room for something else, something quieter. The summer of 1983 became the worst drought in Harlan County in 50 years. The Cimarron Fork hit 7 inches in the center channel at the county bridge by the first week of August, barely running. The riverbed was visible on both banks and stretches where it had always run knee-deep. The cottonwoods on the east bank were beginning to show stress. 5 of the 6 electric centrifugal pump systems on the fork went offline between August 4th and August 19th. Their intakes were dry or nearly dry. The motors spun. Nothing moved. Linda Brooks, the county water engineer, drove the fork road on August 6th and stopped at each farm with a clipboard. She was measuring. She was beginning to understand the scale of what was happening, because the calls coming into the county office were multiplying, and they all said the same thing. She pulled into Sarah Whitmore's gate and drove to the river where the diesel pump sat on its low concrete pad, running. She stood there for a while without speaking. She checked the intake depth against the current water line. She looked at the discharge pressure gauge. She looked at the flexible hose section at the end of the intake pipe, oriented toward the east, toward the thin remaining thread of the fork's flow. That's not standard installation." "No," Sarah said. "Whose idea was it?" "My father's," Sarah said. "He wrote it up in 1971. Linda looked at the gauge, looked at the intake, made a note. "How much acreage can you supply from this unit?" she asked. "Mine, and probably a neighbor's if they pipe to my main line," Sarah said. "Maybe 2? Would you be willing to share capacity?" Sarah looked at the river. "That's why I fixed it," she said. 2 more farms tapped in over the next 5 days. Sarah adjusted engine load and monitored discharge pressure daily, trimming the irrigation schedule to match what the pump could sustain at each outflow point without losing efficiency. She did this with a pencil and a notepad and numbers she had worked through the previous winter using formulas from her father's notebook number 5. The volute housing held. Every day it held under operating load and Kansas heat. That was 1 more day of data. By mid-August, she had stopped thinking about the crack in anything but practical terms. It was in the log. It was the thing she checked first during every inspection, and it was holding. Denny Farr had done clean work. Daniel ran the engine checks every morning at 5. He had memorized the startup sequence by heart. He kept the maintenance log without being asked. Linda Brooks submitted a formal report to the Harlan County Water Authority in September of 1983 that analyzed the summer's irrigation failures along the Cimarron Fork. The report ran to 22 pages. It covered water rights, pump installation standards, intake depth requirements, and minimum flow engineering margins. One paragraph near the end read, "One surface pump installation on the fork maintained full operational capacity through the lowest recorded river levels of the season." The installation used a diesel-powered centrifugal pump of 1940s manufacture, set at below standard housing elevation with an extended reach intake pipe and a flexible terminus joint, the latter enabling the intake to be manually directed toward the active flow thread as the river channel migrated under drought conditions. The engineering choices reflected in this installation suggest that county standards for irrigation pump intake depth and terminus design should be reviewed in light of documented drought conditions. It was a government report written in government language. But what it was saying between every line was that one woman had prepared for things the county had not, using knowledge that had been sitting in composition notebooks for 30 years. The drought broke in October. A slow rain, then a steady one, then 3 days of gray Kansas sky pouring water into the fork until it ran 4 feet deep again. Mike Turner stopped by on a Thursday evening. He brought a bottle of bourbon he'd been holding since the previous Christmas. He left it on the porch without making a production of it. Sarah found it there when she went out to check on something before dinner. She brought it inside, set it on the shelf, and went back to work. Frank Dawson saw her at the November auction and made a point of coming over. "I've been thinking about last year," he said. "Don't," she said. "No, he stopped, tried again. "I never even looked at that pump. I read 4 words and moved on." "Most people did," she said. "What made you look?" She considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things. "My father told me the most expensive things at a farm auction are usually the ones that look worthless," she said, "because those are the ones nobody has bid up. If you know what you're looking at, that's where the value is." Frank thought about that for a while. "He teach you the rest of it? The engineering?" "Most of it," she said. "The rest I worked out," he nodded slowly. Then he looked at her in a way that had nothing in it except genuine respect, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "Well," he said, "I'll look closer next time." The Johnston Brothers Model 14 ran through the summer of 1984 without a single failure. The drought returned in June, lighter than 1983, but still enough to drop the fork below viable depth for conventional surface pumps by mid-July. This time, 3 farms along the fork had installed extended intake systems over the winter, following what Linda Brooks had recommended in her report. 2 of them worked correctly. One had a priming problem that Daniel Whitmore diagnosed in 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, having seen the same symptom in his mother's setup the previous February. He was 18. He was calm about it. He explained what was wrong clearly and without condescension, the way people talk when they have actually done something rather than just read about it. The farmer whose pump he fixed, an older man named Art Selby who had been farming that ground for 35 years, watched him work and said afterward, "You learned this from your mother?" "And my grandfather," Daniel said, "mostly from his notebooks." Art nodded. "He was a smart man. He was patient," Daniel said. "He wrote everything down." That evening, Daniel came home and added 3 pages to his own composition notebook. He dated them carefully at the top of the first page, July 14, 1984. He wrote down the priming problem, the diagnosis, the solution, and the principles behind it, the same way his grandfather had written things down, for future people who would need to know. He also added a short section about the volute crack, what it looked like, how his mother had found it, what Denny Farr had done to fix it. He wrote about the pressure test. He wrote down the spec his mother had used for the cooling sand. He wrote, "You don't know if a repair holds until the machine runs. The repair doesn't tell you. The machine does." He was not sure where that idea had come from exactly. He thought it was probably from watching her, more than from anything she had said. He had 7 notebooks by then, filled and organized on the shelf in the machine shed. The Whitmore farm did not become famous. It did not appear in a magazine. No television crew drove out from Wichita to film the pump that saved the county, because that was not quite the story, and Sarah would not have entertained it anyway. What happened was quieter and more permanent than that. The county changed its irrigation pump installation standards in the spring of 1985, requiring extended intake depths and flexible terminus joints for all new surface pump systems on the fork. Linda Brooks presented the recommendation, but in her notes, she cited the Whitmore installation as the documented local example of the principles working under real drought conditions. She also cited Everett Hollis by name, noting that the flexible terminus design had originated from a 1971 field observation recorded in his personal engineering notebooks. It was the first time his name had appeared in an official county document. He had been dead for 11 years. Mike Turner replicated the intake design on all 3 of his pump stations that same spring. He hired Daniel to help with the installation. Frank Dawson started reading the full description of every item before he moved on at auction. The Model 14 diesel pump sat on its concrete pad by the river through every summer from 1982 forward, maintained on a schedule that Sarah kept in a logbook she stored with her father's notebooks. She changed the oil on the engine every 100 hours of operation. She checked the shaft bearings every spring. She checked the volute weld seam every time she ran an inspection, not because it had given her any new trouble, but because that is how you keep a repaired thing repaired. She replaced the priming valve gasket in 1986 with a part she'd had machined to the same specification as the one Gerald had made in Wichita 3 years earlier. The pump never failed in the field, not once. There is a moment near the end of any drought when the river comes back and the whole landscape seems to exhale. You can see it in the grass first, then in the soil along the bank, which darkens and softens as the water table rises. The cottonwoods leaf out again. The red-winged blackbirds come back to the cattails. Sarah Whitmore watched that happen at the south corner of her property every spring, standing on the low bank above the pump pad with a cup of coffee, reading the river the way her father had taught her to, not with instruments but with observation, watercolor, flow sound, bank erosion patterns. The information was always there. It was just a question of who was paying attention. In the late summer of 1984, with the second drought running its course and the pump running its steady low diesel note along the bank, Daniel came and stood beside her in the early morning before the heat set in. He had his notebook under his arm, the new one he had started that spring. "You knew," he said. It was not quite a question. "I thought it was possible," she said. "Knowing and thinking it's possible aren't the same thing. But you prepared like you knew." She was quiet for a moment. The pump ran. The river moved slowly over its sandy bed, lower than it should have been, but still moving. "Your grandfather used to say that preparation isn't about knowing what's going to happen," she said. "It's about deciding how far out you're willing to think." Daniel wrote that down. He wrote it exactly as she had said it, with her name beside it and the date. The pump ran on. Somewhere upriver, water was moving through the main lines of 4 different farms, keeping crops alive through the kind of summer that nobody had planned for. People who had laughed at the machine or ignored it or not understood it now relied on it without quite saying so out loud. And Sarah Whitmore stood on the bank in the early light, watching the river, listening to the engine she had rebuilt from $38 of rust and bad reputation, and felt something that had no particular name. Not pride, exactly. Not vindication. More like the quiet satisfaction of a thing fitting the way it was supposed to fit, in the moment it was supposed to matter. She finished her coffee, she went back to work.